Mom! Mom!
No, just relax.
Mom!
Just relax, Nathaniel.
Police took 3 family members into custody from their home in the village this week.
I gotta arrest someone.
You're Tameeka, right?
Ow!
Just turn around for me, okay?
I'm trying this ass out.
When DHS notified officers, an intellectually disabled 18-year-old gave birth. Authorities could not determine who fathered the child.
Thank you to everyone watching, and a special thank you to our subscribers. Your support means everything. If you haven't subscribed yet, please consider doing so. Here at Unmasked True Crime Stories, we're committed to telling the stories that matter with respect and truth. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Your support helps us keep uncovering the truth. Now, let's get back to the story. In a cold, sterile hospital room, a young woman trembles beneath the fluorescent lights. She clutches a newborn, her arms stiff, her breath uneven, her eyes darting to the door as if waiting for someone, anyone, to take this burden away. The child stirs in her arms, but she doesn't look down. She doesn't coo. She doesn't whisper words of comfort. She just stares straight ahead, as if she is somewhere else entirely. The doctor speaks gently, asking the question that should have had a simple answer. Who is the father? Silence. Her lips part, but no words come out. Her fingers tighten around the hospital blanket, knuckles white. The nurses exchange glances. They've seen fear before. They've seen pain, but this is something else. The doctor asks again, who is the father of this child? The air in the room thickens. Seconds stretch into eternity. And then a whisper, so faint, so fragile, it barely exists. But what she says next is not an answer. I can't. Somewhere down the hall, a clock ticks on the wall, indifferent to the weight of the moment. A life has just entered this world, but with it, an unbearable truth waits just beyond the door. A social worker steps in, clipboard in hand, her eyes already scanning the girl, reading the bruises that aren't on her skin, but in her vacant stare, in the way she shrinks at the sound of approaching footsteps. And then comes the request. We need a DNA test. No one in that hospital could have imagined what those results would reveal. No one could have braced for the storm it would unleash. Because the truth was worse than anything they had feared. In a quiet neighborhood in Oklahoma, behind the walls of an unassuming home, a nightmare had been unfolding for years. Hidden in plain sight, ignored by the very people meant to protect. A father, a mother, a son, a daughter, a family bound not just by blood, but by secrets. And when those secrets came to light, the entire city would recoil in horror. This is the story of the Molden family. A story of betrayal. A story of neglect. A story of a failed family unit that left an innocent young woman to suffer in silence. Where was the father who should have led? Where was the mother who should have protected? Where was the love that should have shielded her from harm? And when the DNA test was finally complete, what it revealed would shake Oklahoma to its core. In the heart of Oklahoma, past the quiet streets and weathered houses, stood a home like any other, a simple structure with a peeling porch, rusting swings in the yard, and a mailbox that had seen better days. A house that neighbors barely glanced at, a house that held memories, laughter, routine. But behind its closed doors, behind the mundane hum of daily life, there was something else, something far removed from the picture of normalcy it projected. This was the home of the Molden family. Nathaniel Molden, Sr, the father. A man who should have been a pillar of strength, a protector, a leader. The one whose duty was to guide, to discipline, to uphold a home where his children were safe. Tameeka Molden, the mother, The nurturer, the one who should have been the first to sense when something was wrong, to stand in the way of harm, to wrap her arms around her daughter and tell her that no pain, no fear, no suffering would ever touch her under her watch. Nathaniel Molden Jr, the son, the eldest child, the one who should have been a guardian to his younger sister, a role model, a brother in every sacred sense of the word. And then there was her, a young woman who never had the chance to be a child, a girl whose innocence was stolen long before anyone could step in, a daughter who lived in a home filled with people but had never felt more alone. She was different, not in spirit, not in heart, but in the way the world saw her, the way her mind worked, the way she needed just a little more guidance, a little more patience, a little more protection. She wasn't like other 18-year-olds, not because she was incapable of love, of joy, of understanding, but because the world had labeled her differently. A disability, they called it, a diagnosis written in medical files, spoken about in hushed tones, leaving her vulnerable in a way that no child should ever be. And inside that house, in a place that should have been a sanctuary, for years there were whispers, maybe not spoken aloud but felt, neighbors who sensed something but never asked, teachers who saw fleeting glimpses of discomfort, of quiet distress, but convinced themselves it was nothing, friends, if she had any, who noticed her withdrawn stares, her uneasy silence, her avoidance of touch. But the people who should have seen it most clearly, the ones who lived under that very roof, who shared the same meals, the same spaces, the same air, they did nothing. They looked away, or worse, they knew. And as the seasons passed and the walls of that house continued to trap its secrets, something was happening behind them. Something that should have been impossible. Something that should have never, under any circumstances, taken place. A child was growing. And when the truth was forced into the light, when there was no more denying, no more avoiding, no more pretending, the question was no longer whether this family had failed their daughter. It was how long they had been letting it happen. It should have been a moment of joy, a new life entering the world, a mother cradling her newborn with warmth, with love, with the quiet, overwhelming realization that everything had changed. But in that hospital room, there was no joy, no warmth, only fear. She lay on the stiff, sterile bed, barely understanding what had just happened to her body. The pain lingered, the exhaustion weighed down on her, but nothing compared to the confusion in her eyes. The way she looked around the room, searching for answers, for reassurance, searching for someone to tell her what came next. Because she didn't know. She didn't understand what had been done to her. She didn't understand how she had gotten here. And when the doctor asked her a question that should have had only one answer, when they asked her who the father was, her lips barely parted, her hands gripped the thin hospital blanket, her breath shaky, her mind somewhere far away. I don't know. But someone knew. Someone had known all along. The pregnancy had not been a mystery to those in the Molden household. It was not a secret that had gone unnoticed, not a quiet development that had been hidden behind closed doors. Nathaniel Molden Jr. knew, and so did his parents. They had watched it happen. They had seen their daughter, an 18-year-old with the mind of a child, her body changing, her silence growing heavier, her confusion more visible with each passing day. They had known what it meant. They had known who was responsible. And they had done nothing. They had not stopped it. They had not intervened. They had let it happen. The house should have been a refuge, a place where she was safe, where she was nurtured, where she was loved. Instead, it had become a prison of silence, of complicity, of unspeakable betrayal. And when she was finally wheeled into that delivery room, surrounded by strangers in masks and gloves, she had no idea that what had been kept in the shadows was about to be exposed for the entire world to see. It wasn't long before the whispers began, nurses exchanging glances, doctors asking quiet questions. A social worker being called into the room, flipping through papers, scanning the girl's vacant stare, noting the details that didn't add up. And then came the test. A DNA test. A simple swab, a process that would take days to confirm. Days in which the weight of the truth hung in the air, unspoken but undeniable. When the results came back, there was no more room for doubt. The father of the child was her own brother, Nathaniel Molden Jr. The crime that had been allowed to fester within that household had finally been dragged into the light. The walls that had kept the secret hidden could no longer contain it. The authorities were called. Reports were filed. The truth, horrific, inescapable, was now in the hands of the law. But even as investigators began unraveling the details, even as the evidence mounted, there was one question no one could seem to answer. Why? Why had no one stopped this? Why had two parents stood by, knowing what was happening to their own daughter, and said nothing? Why had they let their son do the unthinkable, while the one person who needed protection the most was left defenseless? There are crimes that shock a community, crimes that make headlines, that send shivers down the spines of those who read about them. But then there are crimes like this. Crimes that make people look at their own homes, their own families, their own children, and ask themselves how something so horrifying could happen in a place that was supposed to be safe. And how many other victims have been silenced behind closed doors, with no one willing to listen. The truth had been revealed, but it was only the beginning. What followed would shake the very foundation of this small Oklahoma town, leaving a trail of shock, disbelief, and broken trust in its wake. After the DNA test confirmed the horrifying truth that Nathaniel Molden Jr. was the father of his sister's child, authorities moved swiftly. There was no more hiding behind the walls of that quiet house. No more turning a blind eye. The police arrived at the Molden home in the dead of night, their flashing lights cutting through the darkness like a beacon of revelation. Crime scene tape was unfurled around the property, marking the once sacred ground as the epicenter of a legal storm that no one had seen coming. The neighborhood, once oblivious, now stood in stunned silence. It was hard to believe that just weeks before, the Molden family had been like any other, a father, a mother, a son, and a daughter, no different from the countless other families in that town. And yet, here they were, facing the full weight of the law. Nathaniel Molden Jr. was arrested first. The charge. When he was placed in handcuffs, there was no remorse on his face, no sign of regret in his eyes. Just a cold, vacant stare as he was led to the police car, the flashing lights illuminating his face, forever capturing the moment he became a criminal in the eyes of the law. His parents, Nathaniel Sr. and Tameeka Molden, were not spared either. They too faced charges, not for the abuse itself, but for their role in allowing it to happen, for their failure to protect their daughter, for their complicity in the crime that had been carried out under their roof. Child neglect. The charges against them were almost as shocking as those against their son. How could parents, the very people entrusted with the care and safety of their children, fail so completely? How could they stand by as their own daughter was victimized in the one place that should have been her sanctuary? The investigation was meticulous. Detectives combed through the Molden home, searching for anything that could shed light on the depth of the abuse. They found old photographs, snapshots of a family who appeared happy, content, living a life they thought they knew. But behind those smiles was a different story, one that had been hidden for years. Interviews were conducted with neighbors, teachers, and friends, each one offering a glimpse into a world no one had fully understood. The pieces of the puzzle slowly started to come together, each one more disturbing than the last. Police interrogations of Nathaniel Jr. were tense. In the sterile, cold interrogation room, the walls seemed to close in on him, yet his answers remained guarded, defensive. He confessed, but in the most dispassionate way imaginable, as if speaking of something detached from himself. His words lacked emotion, as if he couldn't fully grasp the horror of what he had done. Meanwhile, his parents were questioned as well. Their silence was deafening. They had known. Everyone could see it now. They had known about their son's actions, about the growing danger inside their own home, and yet they had done nothing. The questions came fast. How could they allow this? How could they fail their daughter so completely? How could they justify standing by while the most horrific of crimes was committed beneath their roof? But their answers were vague, evasive. The shock of the situation left them unprepared, stumbling over their words, unable to provide the clarity the community so desperately needed. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that this was not just a case of incest, but one of profound failure on multiple levels. The question of how the community had missed the warning signs hung heavy in the air. The shockwaves rippled beyond the Molden family's home and into the very fabric of the town. Families began to question their own roles, their own vigilance. Were there other families where this could be happening, hidden behind the facade of normalcy? Was this an isolated case, or was it a deeper, more pervasive issue that needed to be addressed? The arrest of Nathaniel Jr. and his parents rocked the town to its core, but the legal storm was just beginning. As the case moved into the courtroom, the tension only grew. The courtroom was filled with onlookers, some seeking justice, others simply unable to fathom what had happened. The shock of the charges was palpable, but the legal ramifications were just as severe. This wasn't just about a crime. It was about a breakdown of the very structures meant to protect the vulnerable, a failure on every level. The echoes of betrayal reverberated through the streets of Oklahoma, and no one could escape the weight of what had been exposed. The legal proceedings would soon unfold, but for now, the town was left to grapple with the harsh reality of the Molden family's dark secret. A reality that no one had ever expected. When the truth emerged, it wasn't just the Molden family who felt the weight of their actions. The entire community, one that had stood by, unaware of the darkness lurking behind closed doors, left in shock. What had been exposed shattered the illusion of safety, of normalcy. The news spread like wildfire, every headline echoing the same horrifying revelation. Local news outlets scrambled to report the details, each segment more disbelieving than the last. How could this happen? How could a brother betray his sister in such a way? And how could parents stand idly by? The town of Oklahoma was now a place marked by this unimaginable crime, and the air seemed to hang heavy with a collective sense of disbelief. The questions were endless, and answers were scarce. Law enforcement, tasked with uncovering the truth, struggled to contain the anger and confusion that swelled in the wake of the arrests. Statements from local authorities only seemed to heighten the shock. How could the system have failed this family so completely? How could those meant to protect not have seen the signs of abuse before it reached such a devastating point? The outrage didn't stay confined to the streets of Oklahoma. News outlets from across the country picked up the story, adding to the firestorm of reactions. On social media, the public response was swift, raw, and unfiltered. Comments poured in, condemning the actions of Nathaniel Molden Jr. and his parents, calling for justice, for accountability. People demanded answers, their voices carrying across platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. The hashtag #GMoldenFamilyCase began trending, amplifying the outcry from the public, as if every person was united by a shared sense of horror. How could they let this happen? one post read. How did no one notice? Others, equally enraged, focused their anger on Child Protective Services. Why wasn't she protected? What took so long? The public fury was palpable. The failure of the family, the failure of the system. It seemed like a cruel betrayal of the very concept of safety. The outrage went beyond the family itself. It was about what this crime represented. A failure not just in one home, but in the entire structure meant to protect the most vulnerable. Advocates for child protection, social workers, and law enforcement officials rallied together, calling for reform in child protective services. They spoke out about the need for more rigorous intervention, more vigilance, more resources to ensure that children, especially those who are intellectually disabled or vulnerable, are not left at risk. This case had revealed a terrifying flaw in the system, one that demanded urgent attention. Meanwhile, the courtroom outside was met with protests. Groups of people gathered, some holding signs demanding justice for the victim, others demanding stricter penalties for those who fail to protect children. They were there to make their voices heard, to show the world that this crime, though perpetrated by one family, had deep, far-reaching consequences. The protests were loud, filled with anger and sadness in equal measure. They weren't just fighting for justice in this case. They were fighting for a change that would ensure no child would ever have to face what this young woman had gone through. And then there were the rumors, the stories whispered in hushed voices, the accusations that pointed to deeper issues within child protective services. Could this happen again? What could have been done differently? The media, as it often does in cases of this magnitude, was relentless. Cameras were pointed at the homes of law enforcement officials, child protection advocates, even the Molden family's neighbors, anyone who might have insight into the tragedy. People wanted to understand how something like this could happen. They wanted answers, and they wanted them now. The community's grief was compounded by a growing sense of shame. The Molden family had once been just like any other family in this town, blending in, attending church, raising their children. But now they were seen as symbols of something darker. The family had become a cautionary tale, a stark reminder that even those who seem the most ordinary can harbor the most unspeakable secrets. As the public outrage swelled, one question remained at the forefront of every mind. How could the parents, who were entrusted with their children's lives, have allowed this to happen? How could they have failed so completely? The case had ripped apart the very notion of family, of trust, and left the community wondering how many other quiet secrets were still waiting to be unearthed. The implications were far-reaching. Not just for the Molden family, but for the very fabric of society. How could they protect their most vulnerable if they missed the signs when they were right in front of them? The tragedy of the Molden family was more than a local story. It had become a national conversation, a public reckoning with the systems in place to protect children. But for the community of Oklahoma, the emotional scars of this revelation would last long after the case was closed. As the dust begins to settle, the story of the Molden family doesn't end here. Far from it, the tragic truth that unraveled in Oklahoma is still far from closure. Nathaniel Molden Jr. remains locked behind bars at the Oklahoma County Detention Center, his life now suspended in a grim holding pattern. Charged with incest, the weight of his actions and the magnitude of the betrayal he inflicted on his sister now rests on the shoulders of the legal system. A $25,000 bond has been set, but whether he will ever walk free again remains uncertain. The walls of his confinement are a far cry from the life he once knew, a life now tainted by the unimaginable crime he committed. And then there are his parents, Nathaniel Molden Sr. and Tameeka Molden. Though the gravity of the charges against them pales in comparison to the horror their son faces, their role in this tragedy is no less significant. Both have been released on bond and are now awaiting their day in court, charged with child neglect. Their decision to turn a blind eye, to allow the abuse to continue in their home, has left an indelible mark on their own futures. The questions surrounding their involvement, how could they stand by, knowing what was happening to their daughter, remain unanswered for now. The legal proceedings are far from over. With each passing day, new developments could arise, potentially shifting the course of this case. The community's need for justice continues to burn, and the Molden family's future now hangs in the balance as the court prepares to address the devastating choices they made. Though this chapter of their lives is still being written, one thing is certain. The echoes of this crime will ripple through Oklahoma for years to come. As the trial looms closer, there's still so much left to be revealed. Will the Molden family ever truly be held accountable for what they've done? Or will this dark chapter fade into something the justice system fails to fully address? Time will tell. But for now, the Molden family's fate remains uncertain, and the story is far from over. This case, it's more than just a tragedy. It's a haunting reminder of how the most vulnerable among us can be failed by those who should have protected them. A young woman lost in a world she could not escape, betrayed by her own flesh and blood. Her brother's betrayal and the silence of her parents have shattered a family, leaving broken pieces where trust once stood. But perhaps the most haunting question of all, how did this go unnoticed for so long? How did a community, a family, fail to see what was happening behind closed doors? The pain of this revelation will echo for years to come, with lives forever changed by choices made in the shadows. As this case unfolds in the courts, one thing is clear: justice must be served. No amount of time can undo the damage done, but accountability must be sought. What are your thoughts? Let us know in the comments below. If you found this case important, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Your support helps bring these stories to light, raising awareness where it is most needed. Thank you for being part of this journey with us.